I want to mention a few preliminary things. First of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me to come. And I don't know if it's Ann Fox or who was responsible for speakers, but you've had also some great speakers this morning. I mean, I think Mark Rienzi is a superstar law professor in the making, and he is such a pro-life advocate that I'm just very excited to see a young guy like that with all his intelligence and all his commitment. And Hans also is a leading lawyer in Washington. So you've heard from some great folks. I want to mention a couple things about Americans United for Life. You may all know them very well. If you're a lawyer, you probably worked there at one time or another. Dan was telling me he did in law school, or was that while he was in law school? Americans United for Life was actually founded in Washington, then moved to Chicago, and just a couple of years ago received some huge grants and moved to D.C., and that's when I went to work for them. I've been working for Family Research Council for over a decade before that. But AUL expanded its work into the national and the international. Before that, it had been primarily doing state-level work. So I know that many of you know AUL. I just wanted to mention that in case you don't. We have a brochure out there on the check-in table if you'd like one. And also for any of the lawyers here, we've started a national group of pro-life lawyers called Lawyers for Life, and there's business cards out there if you'd like to sign up for that. We'd be happy to have you. I also want to point out that in your packet, one of the things you have is from Americans United for Life, are what we're calling talking points on assisted suicide. Basically, it's a summary of many of the points on assisted suicide that are important, some of which I'll make today, some of which I won't. I believe it has footnotes for you. One other thing I wanted to mention from the healthcare, just flag it for you, I'm sure you know it, but I don't think it was mentioned this morning when Hans was speaking, but there's the preventive care mandate. So Obamacare has an undefined term called preventive care, which will be required for all insurance companies. It's not something you can get out of by opting out of, you have on the state exchanges, you could have a pro-abortion insurance plan and a pro-life insurance plan, or you could opt out of it. You have and some states have done that. We have a model bill, and many, half a dozen states, 10 states have opted out. This preventive care mandate is not part of that. And right over the last 6 months, hearings have been held. A department under HHS is going to define what preventive care means, and I don't think it will directly include abortion, because even on the floor of the U.S. Senate, the sponsor, who was Barbara Mikulski, said, no, of course it doesn't include abortion. So they have a hard time doing that, but I do think it's quite likely that they will try to cover abortifacient drugs under a contraceptive mandate. So anyway, if you're not aware of that, I hate to bring that to your attention, but that is a big worry. And I think that the definitions have to come out by the end of August. So we've been working on that, as have all the other groups. So my topic for you is why doctor-prescribed suicide should not be legalized in Massachusetts. I mentioned this topic, I was over at Harvard Law School yesterday. I was speaking to Professor Glendon, Marianne Glendon, and we both, in a way, chuckled that anybody has to make such a talk. I mean, can you imagine? It's what kind of world do we live in where the possibility of doctor-prescribed suicide is being considered? But the fact is, it is. And it's being considered by many countries around the world. An Indian case, a court in India just found a limited right to assisted suicide. So it's not just in the United States, but it certainly is very present in the United States. And part of our problem, I think, in dealing with this concept of doctor-prescribed suicide is this idea of rights. Do I have a right somehow to assisted suicide? And I think that part of our problem in thinking through that question goes back to something Professor Glendon has written quite a bit about, and I hope you probably have read her book called Rights Talk. And the problem in our culture is that a real understanding of what is a right has been lost. And we conflate wishes with rights, as she again discussed in her book. And sometimes it's suggested that individual rights are more important than collective interests or collective rights. But I think that this is a false understanding of rights. Not only are wishes not rights, but the whole idea of what is a right, or maybe I would say a human right, because I hope this doesn't make you suspect me, but I call myself a human rights lawyer. And the reason I call myself a human rights lawyer is not because I'm a leftist or whatever. It's because I think or maybe I should say I'm a John Paul II human rights lawyer. In other words, I think that the understanding of human rights as articulated by John Paul II is pretty solid, pretty good, and actually true. I mean, human beings have human rights because they're made in the image and likeness of God. Now, it's true that the left usually uses that term in a bad way, but you know, I was fascinated by Mark Rienzi's talk, and I don't know what y'all thought about it, but to me, it's just marvelous to think of a way to fight back against anti-life forces by using their own weapons. My analogy would be, you know, yesterday Boston finally won the baseball game. Now, I'm a Red Sox fan, because I went to school here, so I've always been a Red Sox fan. And they beat the Yankees.
Yay!
Yay! But if they hadn't there was a ball game scheduled yesterday. If the Red Sox don't show up, they lose the game. They forfeit the game. If you don't show up to fight on the meaning of human rights, we lose the game. Because maybe not in this room, but in the broader community, in Newton and in Boston and in the U.S., human rights is a term that ordinary people seem to resonate to. I mean, it seems to speak to them. Now, they may have an unsophisticated understanding, but I think their basic feeling is that there is a dignity in human beings. And I agree, and I'm sure you agree. So we got to fight, in my opinion, for the meaning of human rights and for a proper understanding of rights. And in fact, since human beings live in community, an aspect of human rights does concern communities. We're not these autonomous individuals who live alone on a planet by ourselves. We live in a very crowded Newton, Massachusetts, or Washington, D.C., with lots of other people. And of course, then we're in our families, we're in our churches, or what other civic organizations we might be in. We're not alone. We're not autonomous atoms. But the communities we live in are not obligated to indulge every one of our whims or everything that we call a right of ours. Rather, they are, in a sense, obligated to recognize what's good for us. Rights properly understood are reflections of what is good for the human person. And so society has an obligation to respect and promote the good of the person, not an individual's subjective desires. Recognizing and respecting legitimate individual human rights promotes the common good, in my opinion, and vice versa. Thus, a proper understanding of human rights reconciles any conflicts between the individual and the greater society or the collective. But false human rights threatens both individual good and the good of the community. And one of these false rights that is sometimes suggested is this right to either doctor-prescribed suicide, or sometimes it's called, it has been called in the past, a right to die. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is, first of all, look at what it means, this right to die. Then look at whether there's a foundation in the law for the right to die. Third of all, I'm going to explain why creating a new right to die is detrimental to society, particularly the medical profession, and the elderly or the sick. And then fourth, I will look at the experience of the Netherlands to illustrate why a right to die, the so-called right to die, where it has been created, is uncontainable and will be transformed into a right to kill. In fact, the very individuals who most need the protection of human rights law are assaulted when a right to die is advanced as a human right. Rather than enabling them to act consistently with their inherent dignity, a false right to die makes them more vulnerable and makes them the victim of even greater indignities. First of all, a right to die is not synonymous with an individual's right to refuse medical treatment. A patient may always choose to die from an underlying condition. This understanding reflects in part a legal tradition in the West that unwanted medical intervention is a form of battery. You know, for those of you who aren't lawyers, assault and battery. Well, it's a form of unwanted touching, unwanted medical intervention. It's, in other words, this right to refuse medical treatment is not some theory kind of out of the sky. It is based in the tort common law tradition. Similarly, medical treatment once begun may be discontinued if it becomes overly burdensome. However, a right to die is usually meant not to refer to these situations, but to be either doctor-prescribed suicide, or euthanasia. So that's what the right to die usually means, at least in the current arguments. I'm sure you all know this, since you're members of this group, that what euthanasia is, but I just want to review it for just a second. Euthanasia means the intentional killing of a patient by a doctor because death is thought to benefit the patient. So, first of all, euthanasia requires intentional killing. It's not euthanasia when a doctor only foresees that his patient's life will be shortened. For example, when treatment is removed because it's become too burdensome for the patient, though with the knowledge that this will shorten the patient's life. This is an important distinction. Foreseeing death, and intending death are not the same thing. It's euthanasia when the doctor's aim, the intention is to end the life of the patient. However, advocates of euthanasia argue that such intentional killing by a doctor is not homicide. You would think, if you step back from this and you've never heard this discussion before, you'd think, well, if a doctor does something and intends the patient's life to end, that's homicide. If I take a gun and shoot you, and I'm trying to kill you, that's homicide. Why isn't euthanasia homicide? Well, advocates of euthanasia argue that this killing by the doctor is distinguishable because of the motive of the doctor. Euthanasia is claimed by these advocates to be to the benefit of the patient. Now, if that were true, it means logically certain people are better off dead. If I kill you, and that's to your benefit, it means you are better off dead. That's logical, I think, inescapable. In physician-assisted suicide, as opposed to euthanasia, it's the patient, not the doctor, who performs the final act which causes death. So the physician's role is one of intentional assistance to the patient to commit suicide by providing the means, advice, or encouragement for the suicide. So the doctor prescribes the pills, even furnishes the pills, but the patient takes the pills. In both assisted suicide or doctor-prescribed suicide and euthanasia, what is promoted as a right to die is killing a patient by means other than his underlying condition. So whatever it is that you are ill from is not what kills you. What kills you is a different act. So if you had cancer that was judged to be terminal 6 months from now, you wouldn't die from the cancer. You would die from an act of in euthanasia by a doctor killing you with an injection or something, or maybe with doctor-prescribed suicide by taking pills that a doctor has prescribed for you. Now, in the rest of my talk, I'm going to use these terms fairly interchangeably. And part of the reason for that is advocates for doctor-prescribed suicide, or let me put it the other way around, advocates for euthanasia and doctors experienced with euthanasia reject the distinction that Oregon made, where Oregon says the only thing that's legal is doctor-prescribed suicide, not euthanasia, because these folks who have the experience in it say that you must have a right for the doctor to finish off an unsuccessful attempt at assisting suicide, that it will happen over and over, and that any distinction drawn in the law between the two, in practical terms, will never be upheld. So, in what follows, I will talk about euthanasia and doctor-prescribed suicide. I'll use the terms back and forth. Remember, euthanasia is doctor directly killing. Doctor-prescribed suicide is supposed to be a doctor prescribing pills that the patient takes. Why doctor? I mean, it could say you're sick, or you're in pain, you come to me and you say, I can't stand the pain anymore, please kill me. And if I shoot you, why isn't that euthanasia? Well, you could define euthanasia that way, but most of the advocates do not. They usually, for reasons we can only speculate about, but they want to medicalize it, the procedure. So it's a doctor who does the killing. It's a doctor who prescribes the medicine, which is used to kill. There are also distinctions between different kinds of euthanasia, which I will mention and return to a little bit further along in my talk. One is voluntary euthanasia. That is the quintessential case that you always hear about, which is the fully competent adult who has a terminal illness and who asks to be killed, or who asks for the doctor to prescribe pills by which he can kill himself. But there are other kinds of euthanasia as well. There's non-voluntary euthanasia, which means, or physician-prescribed death, which means someone who cannot request it. Who might that be? Somebody with dementia, a baby. If you can't request it, then and you're euthanized or whatever, it's non-voluntary. And then there's involuntary euthanasia. I mean, I know this is just a talk, so I don't want to get too hung up on these, but just to help you think about it. What's non-voluntary? Well, take the first example of the fully competent adult who's got a illness that they've been diagnosed is going to kill them in 6 months. And they go to the hospital, but they don't ask for euthanasia. That's involuntary. And you'll find out in just a couple of minutes when we discuss the situation in the Netherlands that this is not just a theoretical possibility. So, I'm a lawyer, so the question I'm going to ask, and it's like Mark Rienzi's talk, where is the right, if there is a right, where is it rooted? If there's a human right to a physician-prescribed dying, where does that right exist? I want to start by talking, because again, I think the lingo of the discussion, and probably the lingo that will be used in Massachusetts to some extent, is about human rights. Okay? So first of all, is there an international human right? Is there some right to physician-assisted suicide that exists in the documents of international law or international practice? The short answer is no. There simply is no such right recognized in the document. In fact, you'd be interested probably to know, and this is something I do a lot of work in, so it may not be so interesting to you, but it may be boring to you, but it's very interesting to me, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out in 1948 at the end of World War II, after World War II, and the point was to avoid wars in the future, and it was asserted that violations of human rights led to war. So does that document say anything about a right to physician-prescribed death? No, it doesn't. In fact, it says everyone has the right to life. There's a treaty. If you don't know what treaties are, it's very simple to understand. They're like a contract. Although, if you buy a car, or you rent an apartment, or you buy a house, you sign a contract. A treaty is simply kind of a contract among nations instead of between individuals. So Great Britain, the U.S., Canada, Mexico, South Africa, Morocco could agree to a treaty. Any number of countries could agree, but it only binds the countries who have agreed. If you execute a contract with me, somebody else can't sue about that contract. They're not a party to it. Same thing with a treaty. If you're not a party to the treaty, you're not bound by the treaty. The most well-known treaty, extensively ratified by most nations, including the United States, is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it says, every human being has the inherent right to life. Further, it says, this right of every human being shall be protected by law, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life. End quote. Now, there are arguments actually about whether that means there's no right to abortion. I'm not involved in that right now. We can talk about it later. But what I want to point out is there's nothing in these documents that gives a right to physician-assisted suicide. If anything, the documents are pro-life rather than anti-life, and they prohibit arbitrary killing. Now, whether you're bound by the treaty or not, again, I'm not arguing, making that technical legal point. I'm just saying the argument, in Massachusetts, let's say they propose a bill for doctor-prescribed suicide. And people are saying that's a human right. And you can simply say, it isn't, show me where's the human right, because human rights are not just what your opponent says. They're show me some document where it says you have a right to do this. And there's no document that says it. Now, there's a second way to create international law, which is customs. So, whereas a treaty is like a written contract, a custom is just how do nations operate. If everybody at Boston College Law School, every Monday morning gathered together to pledge allegiance to the flag, and they did that this year, and they did it next year, and it became a tradition that was handed down, and freshmen did it, and they looked forward to doing it, first-year law students. That's a custom. It's not written down. But in international law, if it becomes unanimously followed by the nations, it becomes law. So if there's a custom followed by all the nations, in other words, if there's universal practice, then it's recognized as an international law right. Can there be a customary right to physician-assisted suicide? No, there's no way there can be, because only 5 or 6 countries in the world permit it. So since it requires universal practice, there isn't. At most, there's 5 or 6 countries that permit physician-prescribed death. So if anybody makes to you an argument that human rights give a right to physician-assisted suicide or physician-prescribed death, the answer is no, it isn't. Unless they want to just say, well, blah, 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 it's because I say it is. And then you've got to, I think even then you're into a good argument, a good discussion, because why did what they say matter more than what you say? So if you have an argument about a reasoned argument, and they say it's a human right, my first point is there is no right under international law. You can tell them that. Second of all, is there a right under our Constitution? The answer to that is no. Mark Rienzi put up on the board, up here on the screen, I think an excerpt from the Glucksberg case. That was in 1997, and you probably, again, are very familiar with this case, but in case you're not, the question was, is there a right to basically assisted suicide under the U.S. Constitution? And in fact, it's interesting because Mark also put up here on the screen that language from Planned Parenthood v. Casey, in which the Supreme Court said you have the right to define the meaning of life and of the universe, and etc. Do you remember that quote he put up there? Well, that same quote was at issue. The Planned Parenthood v. Casey case was in 1992. Glucksberg was in 1997. So 5 years later. So those people who wanted to say there's a right to physician-assisted suicide under the Constitution, under substantive due process, which Mark mentioned before, under liberty, remember no one may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process, 14th Amendment, substantive due process, they said, we want the court to recognize that includes a right to doctor-assisted suicide. The court rejected it. Okay, so we all know that the court was wrong to find a right to abortion under the Constitution. Okay. Even so, the court recognizes that right, and under the philosophical or jurisprudential theory by which they recognize a right to abortion, they rejected a right to physician-assisted suicide. Okay? So even if you take this definition, which is an absurd definition that he put on the board, that everyone has the right to define the meaning of the universe, and this has legal consequences for everybody else. They use that to justify abortion. They refuse to use it to justify assisted suicide. So, in fact, the court said there's a quote, I'm quoting the court, a consistent and almost universal tradition that has long rejected the asserted right to assisted suicide, and continues to explicitly reject it today, even for terminally ill, mentally competent adults. End quote. The court, so even that paradigmatic case I gave you, this fully competent person who's got a terminal illness and who asked to be killed, the court points out the tradition almost universally, consistently, and today rejects that that is a right, a liberty right protected by the Constitution. The court said finding such a right to physician-assisted suicide would, quote, reverse centuries of legal doctrine and practice and strike down the considered policy choice of almost every state in the United States, end quote. So, no right under international human rights, or no right under international law, no human right to it, no national, federal, constitutional right to assisted suicide. What does that mean? Does that mean we can all go home? No, it means we all got to get to work because they can go to Massachusetts, they can go to Vermont, they can go to New Hampshire. So, in other words, as you all know, if the national government is not displacing the states have all the power to decide issues. So it's up to the states to decide whether or not to recognize assisted suicide. And so far, Washington and Oregon have recognized rights to assisted suicide. But there are efforts that are almost, those in favor of assisted suicide are working all the time to advance this right. In a way, if you can imagine it, imagine we're pre-Roe v. Wade. Those who are in favor of abortion are working everywhere all the time to advance it. It's just they changed their tactics and their targets and their language depending on what they think will be most successful. So as I mentioned, they've gone to a ballot initiative in a couple of states in the Northwest. They've tried legal courtroom cases in a couple of places. They're trying to move in So it's in the Northwest and the Northeast, Oregon, Washington, they're trying Montana, they were trying Idaho, and then in the Northeast, Vermont, New Hampshire, in the past Maine, but probably soon Massachusetts. Now sometimes the language in the states is in the terms of the reason we should recognize a right to physician prescribes death is because the decision of someone to ask for that is a, quote, deeply personal, quote, choice, end quote. But again, the Supreme Court, although it didn't reject this for the states, its language, we should be educated by this and use this in Massachusetts or elsewhere, but I'm going to quote the Supreme Court. The decision to commit suicide may be just as personal and as profound as a decision to refuse unwanted medical treatment. But it has never enjoyed similar legal protection. Indeed, the two acts are widely and reasonably regarded as quite distinct, end quote. Autonomy, which is our decision, our capacity to make choices, deeply personal choices, is important. But autonomy is not a right that must always be honored. So you can't logically imply a right to be killed from a right to personal freedom. Simply, fact is, no society anywhere has ever recognized every individual desire as worthy of legal protection. The example I like is if you drive through Boston, if you want to drive on a Saturday morning, if you want to drive through Boston at 100 miles an hour, good luck. You're going to go to jail. They're going to arrest you and put you in jail. You may have decided that you want to go 100 miles an hour and it expresses some deep thing you have, but the fact is, it doesn't have to be recognized. So, just because it's a deeply personal choice does not mean the law must recognize it. Now, beyond pointing out that this right to assisted suicide has not been recognized historically in the West, the court also identified several state interests in Glucksburg against creating such a right. And I'm going to use that as a framework to talk about some of the reasons why a legislature in Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Vermont or Montana should not recognize a right to assisted suicide. So there's no international right, there's no human right, there's no federal constitutional right. Should Massachusetts recognize it? No. Why not? Here's some of the reasons why not. And I guess parentheses, the state does not have to recognize every individual wish, as I just said. It never has. It's kind of a foolish argument that just because it's personally felt to you, it must be recognized under the law. The question is does it affect the common good, and is it good for you? Because the state has and has the right to prohibit certain acts that you may find important to you. Again, like you don't want to wear a seatbelt. Don't wear a seatbelt, cop sees you, you get a ticket. So the state can and has regulated behavior that's just limited in a sense to you. But judgment has been made that it's not to your good and it's not to the common good to permit that. So the first interest the state has is simply in protecting life. As I mentioned with those international documents, and despite the fact that abortion is legalized, that does not change the fact, as I think Hans said in the first talk, the fundamental obligation of a state is to protect its citizens and to value human life and to kind of promote law and order. The state has an interest in life and in protecting life. And if individuals live in fear of being arbitrarily killed, you cannot achieve the common good. A fundamental purpose of society is mutual protection. Another reason, and that's what the Supreme Court said. Another reason the court offered to prohibit assisted suicide is, quote, protecting the integrity and ethics of the medical profession, end quote. As I hope is obvious, if you recognize the right to die or a right to physician-prescribed suicide, that would convert the medical profession from one of healing into one of killing. No medical organizations that I'm aware of, except a nurses organization in the United Kingdom, supports assisted suicide because they understand that it undermines the basic ethics of the medical profession, which is to heal, not to kill. A right to die or a right to physician-assisted suicide also would probably violate the conscience rights of doctors and nurses. If an individual's desire to be killed by a doctor rises to the level of a right, I think it would be very difficult to secure legal protection for a conscientious right to object out of that. That's what you're seeing again with the whole abortion argument is that because it's legal, doctors and nurses must do it. Mark Rienzi gave you an argument for why that's not only wrong, but is in fact perhaps unconstitutional, that you may have a constitutional right to freedom of conscience. But I think the same dynamics will be introduced. If we recognize the right to physician-prescribed death, it'll be very difficult for the medical profession or individuals in the medical profession to have their freedom of conscience respected. Also, I think, and perhaps most fundamentally, I don't think that physician-prescribed death responds to the suffering of the patient. It doesn't respond to physical suffering. It doesn't address the underlying conditions. In fact, physician-prescribed suicide sees the patient in a sense and not the pain as the problem to be eliminated. Yet, we have to admit that in our society, many people think it sounds compassionate to offer physician-assisted suicide to someone who suffered from an illness or for someone who is at the end of their life, at the very end of their life. And while it may be very human and to feel sympathetic for the suffering of others, again, what this means in essence is you get rid of the patient, not of the pain. And this is ironic because this is at the moment when palliative care, which is pain ameliorating care, as again I'm sure you all know, palliative care for the physical pain is very, very advanced and very widely available. I'm not a doctor, but the doctors that I know have testified that palliative care is fully effective and obviously it's an ethical alternative. In fact, in 2006, 95% of members of the Royal College of Physicians in the United Kingdom who specialized in palliative care, 95% of those who understood palliative care said in a statement, "We believe that with improvements in palliative care, good clinical care can be provided and patients can die with dignity. There is no need to change current law." End quote. Now, it's also been found, ironically, in Oregon itself by a study conducted by the Health and Science Department, Health and Science University researchers in Oregon. They found this, that when when physician-assisted suicide or physician-prescribed death is legalized, the quality of palliative care deteriorates. So, if the aim of advocates for physician-assisted suicide is they say the suffering patient, the fact is, as found by this study in Oregon, palliative care, the quality of pain-ameliorating care deteriorates when physician-assisted suicide is legalized. If you look at it, for instance, I'll get to it in a minute, but if you look at the Netherlands, they don't have very many hospices, and the hospices they have actually also include a euthanasia component to them. But in countries where physician-assisted suicide is illegal, you have a hospice movement, and you have improvements in palliative care. I'll tell you what the researchers in Oregon found out. They studied patients before and after the legalization of assisted suicide, and they found out that patients dying after the legislation were about twice as likely to experience pain as those before. Now, pain, of course, is not solely physical. It is also deeply emotional and psychological, perhaps, and spiritual. But studies have shown that patients requesting assisted suicide are usually suffering from treatable mental illness. Treatable mental illness. Again, the Royal College of Physicians in England observed that systematic studies have, quote, clearly shown, end quote, the wish for assisted suicide in terminally ill patients is, quote, strongly associated with depression, end quote. It concluded that most physicians cannot diagnose, and if they cannot diagnose, they cannot treat depression. But if it is diagnosed and if it is treated, 99% of those requesting suicide change their minds about wanting it. Now, a patient whose request for assisted suicide is attributable to undiagnosed and untreated mental illness, depression, is not exercising an autonomous choice in any sense that matters. This is a patient who is depressed, who is alone, who is isolated, who perhaps has inadequately treated physical pain. They haven't had adequate palliative care. And now you realize that most of them have clinical depression. And doctors don't recognize it. Doctors don't treat it. Therefore, you're not dealing with the underlying problem. Also, it's not cynical to think that when assisted suicide is legalized, it will be advocated as a cost-effective alternative in these days of healthcare reform and managed health care. And in fact, there's evidence that that is already happening. I mean, it's easy to see that healthcare costs go up for various reasons. How are you going to contain costs? Well, you're going to have to contain costs in various ways. I mean, you're going to have to do it. So how are you going to do it? Well, it's not, what I'm suggesting is one way is to end some care near the end of life. And as I say, it's already happened in the state of Oregon. There's a famous example of a woman who was denied coverage by her insurance company for a life-prolonging drug, but sent her a letter suggesting they would pay for her to kill herself. I mean, by getting physicians prescribed dying. So, again, assisting suicide or doctor-prescribed suicide does not involve treating the hurting patient. Instead, it ignores the patient's pain and introduces the views that some lives are not worth living and therefore not worth saving. This is the most dangerous idea any society can have. That some lives are not worth living. I won't trace it for you. You know it perhaps better than I, but it underlies, the simple fact is that before the Nazi Party was organized, before there were any elections, doctors and lawyers in Germany began to understand and promote euthanasia for certain handicapped people, and they did it out of compassion. The medical profession in Germany was the most advanced in the Western world. It was not full of haters. It was not full of cruel, mean people. What they thought was this was compassion. Compassion means to suffer with, not to eliminate the one who's suffering. If you make that mistake, whose lives are at risk? I'll quote a professor in palliative care from Great Britain who says, "You have to ask why it is that so many people working in palliative medicine in Great Britain see what is going on in places such as Oregon as being so fundamentally dangerous. The reason is we're looking after terminally ill patients and we know how frightened they are, end quote. Okay, how about well, let me quote one thing. I was going to give you some information about the Netherlands, but let me quote the conclusion of the New York State Task Force in 1994, which had members who were pro-assisted suicide and members of the commission who were not in favor of assisted suicide, but they unanimously decided against recommending its legalization. And here's a quote from what they said: legalizing assisted suicide and euthanasia would pose profound risk to many individuals who are ill and vulnerable, end quote. The task force found, now listen to this, because a lot of times this debate is about, supposedly again, about compassion, about who cares for the suffering, and the suggestion is we don't care. It's just the opposite, we do care. And what we know is what I'm about to read you that the New York State Task Force concluded, and it is this: the risk of harm is greatest for the many individuals whose autonomy and well-being are compromised by poverty, lack of access to good medical care, advanced age, or membership in a stigmatized social group, end quote. In other words, legalizing physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia puts the most vulnerable people more at risk. And I'll show you that from looking at the Dutch, what's happened in the Netherlands. The Netherlands legalized assisted suicide in 1984. To sum it up, I'll give you the examples. It shows that you cannot contain, they legalized assisted suicide and euthanasia. You cannot contain it to those, that paradigmatic case of the fully autonomous, fully competent adult who is about to die from a terminal illness. That's what their laws purport to do. It's limited to the, quote, explicit request, end quote, of a patient who is in, quote, unbearable suffering, end quote, is in, quote, unbearable suffering, end quote. But the guidelines are simply flouted by doctors. In 1990, a government-sponsored survey which granted immunity and anonymity to doctors revealed no fewer than 1,000 patients were given a lethal injection without having asked for it. There's your involuntary euthanasia. They didn't ask for it. Now this is in a country whose laws say it must be at the, quote, explicit request, end quote, of the patient. Okay? 1,000 in 1990. In 2005, a similar study documented at least 500 patients who had been killed by doctors without asking for it. Now, when the Dutch considered legalizing euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, those who supported legalization promised that any doctor who killed without request would be prosecuted for murder. But when these studies revealed that patients had been killed without request, the government of the Netherlands instead condoned these killings and described them as, quote, care for the dying, end quote. Now, the Dutch, well, I could give you more from the Netherlands, but the point is not that, again, the Dutch are not bad people. They got bad policy. They got a bad idea. They have accepted the idea that some lives are not worth living. They have empowered doctors to kill. What the experience of the Netherlands shows is that once that empowerment has been made, it's only, in a sense, natural for doctors to begin to judge whether patients lives are worth living. You know, if you have a patient who asks you to die, they have some kind of condition, think of the most terrible condition you can think of. They ask you to die, you kill them. Another patient comes into the hospital. They don't ask you to die, but they still got this incredible, terrible condition, which you know objectively as a medical person is just a terrible, horrible suffering for years and years. If you're going to end unendurable suffering, why does it depend on the request of this person? It doesn't. And the doctors learn that it doesn't. Some lives are not worth living. And why should it matter whether you're at the end of life? You know, in the Netherlands, it's unendurable suffering. Not terminal illness, unendurable suffering. And in fact, if you want to get rid of suffering, why should it matter whether it's terminal illness or not? And then doctors, you know, or nurses judge that somebody has unendurable suffering, and they end their lives. And there are examples in Oregon. I mean, because of the reporting requirements, or lack of, in Oregon, you don't have as many examples, but there have been disturbing cases. You know, for instance, there was a famous case where somebody had requested physician-assisted suicide, he gotten the pills, was unable to take them. Well, let me back up. People went to his house to assist him. In fact, they found that he was miserable and suffering from loneliness and isolation. And as one of the doctors reported it, that was the problem. But the volunteers there assisted him to take these pills. When in fact, what they should have done, and what he clearly wanted, was somebody to love him. Now I hope that doesn't sound like sentimental hogwash to a group like this, but that is what people want. I remember a film from the U.S. Bishops Conference, probably over 10 years ago, with some of these folks who were really in misery, you know, really suffering. And if they get the caring, compassionate, true compassionate care, they don't see their lives as worthless or miserable, and they don't want to die. But before they get that, that's how they feel. So I would say that if this issue comes up, as it probably eventually will in Massachusetts, you remember there's no international right to it. There's no constitutional right to it. And it's a bad idea because it doesn't treat physical pain when we could. It doesn't treat emotional pain because it's not diagnosed and treated because these folks are depressed. And it cannot be contained. You cannot limit it to some autonomous individual who fully decides at the end of their life. Think about something, you know, if you're sick and you're dying, how much is your wish an autonomous wish anyway? And it can't be limited. What it will do is put the most vulnerable, the most needy people most at risk. So it's a very bad idea. Thank you.